Before moving on to palette knife work, make sure your work is dry. You'll need the same colours we've been using for each tutorial. We'll just mix through more white for our lovely highlights. Paintings can really pop when there's a light and dark contrast in there. And I'm looking at this painting at the moment and I'm seeing lots of light in that top section, and it feels like to me it needs a little bit of darkening up. So before we start with the palette knife, I'm going to use my brush and I'm going to darken up some of those lighter bits around that light source just to blend it through a bit better. I'm going to use that small square flat brush that we use for the trees. I'm going to mix some of that phthalo blue and white, and the colour is quite light still. And I'm going to stay very close to the tree line, as you can see, and add that blue in between the trees too. So I'm just moving my way along, filling in any bits that look a bit too light. And I'm also adding some colour to the top parts of the canvas to create a kind of tunnel look for our light feature, for our hero. And just work very intuitively here. Take a step back, have a look, add a bit more if it needs. At this point, you might want to take a step back and just have a look at your painting. You might need to add more trees if you need them. I'm adding a very light phthalo blue and white feature tree near our light source. So you can see I've made the base not so far away in the distance, but more towards the foreground. And I'm keeping that colour a little stronger and darker at the base too. And this tree is going to stand out a little brighter, a little bolder than the other ones. Keep adding trees. We'll add some thin trees with the thin edge of our flat brush. Adding burnt umber to our colour mixes will give a rich dark colour to these trees that we can work on with the palette knife later. Before moving on to palette knife work, make sure your work is dry. You'll need the same colours we've been using for each tutorial. We'll just mix through more white for our lovely highlights. Now that our painting is fully dry, I have a selection of palette knives here I can use for our next part, which is adding our highlights. They're different sizes and shapes, as you can see. And you don't need fancy equipment for most palette knife paintings. I've done many just using a strip of cardboard or an old discount card. For what we need today, a palette knife with a long straight edge is best, as we can add paint to the straight edges of our trees with this. We'll be using more unbleached titanium and titanium white mix. On my clean palette, I've added more paint for mixing. Here is my palette with lots of white for highlights. We have red and blue, and along with that burnt umber for depth, we're using unbleached titanium and white mix for the extra light touches. So we're building up the light on our trees now. We don't want to go straight in and add a really bright colour. We want to build it up slowly and surely by using colours that are very similar to the tree's colours, but maybe not exactly. Here I'm using red and blue and white to get a purple. Use a long straight line edge of your palette knife. After mixing your desired colour, scrape off the excess paint from the palette knife and add a small amount to one of the inner edges. You might want to turn your canvas around at different stages of painting with the palette knife. Might make it easier to apply the paint. Line up the edge of the palette knife with the edge of the largest, darkest tree, let's say. Push down on the palette knife on that edge and slide away from the source of light into the tree. And just keep working down the tree. You might want to add a little paint to the other side, but we don't want the same look on both sides of the tree, so just a little on the other side. And just continuing on with that colour. Add it to the trees of similar colours to the first one you did, just for continuity throughout your picture. Adding another darker layer to our trees, but a little bit lighter than the past ones, we're going to mix the purple that you already have with the blue, like I've got here. And we're going to add colour to the side of the palette knife. And you need very, very little pressure. So just getting that colour right, and then we're barely touching. So we add that fine layer of blue paint over the purple. And we don't want to cover all the purple. This is just a fine layer going over the top. And you might need to wait for each layer to dry before you move ahead. Use the smaller palette knife for the thin trees. I've got the small palette knife here to work with this curved thin tree. I'm very gently adding paint by scraping small amounts onto that edge of the tree that's closest to the light source. That's our hero, and we want that to show through all of our painting. And palette knife painting doesn't need water. Not in this one, we're just simply scraping on the paint. And if you do need to clean your palette knife, just use a cloth or kitchen towel. And this is great when changing colours, so we don't muddy up the next colour with the colour that we've already had on our palette knife. A bit like washing brushes. And we can see that after each scrape with the palette knife, there's a pattern of paint left behind. The canvas and our subsequent paint layers creates these patterns for us. We just need to let the palette knife and the canvas do the work. Pretty cool. Add more white to your purple-blue mix and very gently and with sparse paint on the palette knife, layer up the paint on that highlighted part of the tree. The base of the tree may have fewer highlights depending on how far away it is from the original light source. Get straight edges with the palette knife by adding a sparse amount of paint to that edge, and then place that edge on the canvas 90-degree angle and press down. We can now add that lighter colour that's on our palette knife over to our lighter trees. Taking a look at the colours in our painting so far, I'm seeing lots of purple based colours in the lower parts, the ground parts, and not a lot in the trees. So I'm mixing up some of that red violet that's in the ground ash, and I'm going to add small amounts to the small palette knife and place it on the darker sides of the trees. I'm not trying to balance the whole painting with equal amounts of colour in the bottom and the top halves. I just want to create flow for the eyes by incorporating some of that purple through the top parts of our painting. With a clean, longer palette knife, we're going to mix some white and titanium white to get a light cream colour. You may need a couple of palettes for this painting to work from. Maybe one for darker mixes of colour, one for light. It's really good just to experiment with this. You don't need to try and fit all your colour mixes onto the one palette. So just mixing that white and the unbleached titanium. Get that lighter colour. And when you've got a thin scraping on the palette knife, just add it to the trees closest to the light first. Very gently scrape the paint onto the canvas. Acrylic paints will dry faster when you've applied them lightly, but you may need to wait between each colour change for your highlights. Continue adding darker highlights onto fallen logs. I find with this kind of painting, there is often a need to do some final touch-ups. You can see in the final painting here, I've darkened up the thin tree in the foreground and around the trees on the edges of the picture. I've also added a few purple horizontal brush strokes to give the land a bit more form. And that's it guys, we're done. So I hope you enjoyed painting a forest after a fire scene. If you would like up-to-date access to similar videos of mine, just hit the subscribe button. Happy painting!